Hey everyone, welcome to Guitar Anatomy 101. Today we're going to be taking a very basics first look at guitars, talking about the various sections of the guitar, what they're called, what they do, how they start to work together, and some early easy things that you can do to adjust them and tweak them to get the guitar to a more playable state or fix some pretty simple problems. I want to first note that we're going to be speaking in pretty general terms, though there are some subtle differences whether you're dealing with an acoustic, an electric, or a bass. Today we're going to take it from a flyover level that will allow us to all speak the same language, and for the purposes of this, kind of refer to any of those as just a guitar. So let's go ahead and jump right in. We'll grab a guitar here to demonstrate a little bit, and we'll start at the top. So we're going to be covering, again, just the various sections of the guitar, going over some terminology, and so we'll start with this area up here, which is referred to as the headstock. So primary function of the headstock is really to hold the tuners, sometimes called machine heads, and the tuning pegs where the strings pass through and are wound around. So very obvious that when you turn these tuning knobs, this peg turns and it winds the string either tighter or looser, allowing you to adjust the pitch of each individual string. There's sometimes some string trees here, if you've ever wondered what those are called. Just to put a little bit of back tension on the string up here. Moving right along, we see the strings pass through this section here, which is the guitar nut. This is really important because it's the first anchor point for the strings. You might think that, well, they're held on up here, and that's true, and that creates more or less tension of the strings. This is really going to serve as our first place where the strings pass through and form the area that we are strumming and creating vibration, and so this anchor point becomes important. So again, this is referred to as the nut. Sometimes it may be called the bone because of the material it was at one point made out of. Most of these are synthetic now. So the strings pass through there, and then they run down the neck of the guitar. That's the next section here, is the neck. And the neck also kind of encompasses this front area where you would put your fingers and push down on the strings, which is the fretboard. Individual sections here are called frets, and the metal is actually called fret wire. You may see dots or blocks or various shapes that help you identify which fret you're at quickly and easily. These are called inlays. And again, all of these things are just largely jargon type terms that you wouldn't know unless you heard them or knew what they were, but you might hear someone say, oh hey, at that inlay number 7, and you may not know that that's this dot here, or again, sometimes a different shape. Again, continuing along, we move down the strings and the neck and the fretboard here, and we get to the main section of a guitar. And so this entirety here is referred to as the body. This is kind of the first place that we get into a lot of variation with guitars. And so I'll actually set this one down here and grab an acoustic to demonstrate a little bit. Acoustics probably have the most recognizable guitar shape in terms of the actual outline of the body, but they also are probably one of the thickest guitars that you would see or encounter. And that's mainly because they're hollow on the inside, right? And so some electrics have hollow bodies or semi-hollow bodies as well that would be very similar to that. In fact, I've got a semi-hollow body guitar here. You can see these cutouts where, again, it's actually empty inside of here. But for the acoustic, when you're playing it not plugged into anything, this actually serves a very practical physics type level of why it exists. So when you strum the strings, you're creating a vibration in each one of the strings, and when those strings then vibrate this piece, which we'll get to in a little bit, it vibrates this piece on the body, which is called the soundboard, and the vibrations of that soundboard are actually what's generating the noise that you hear when you play an acoustic guitar unplugged in. And so that reverberates in this empty chamber and then comes out through the sound hole, and that's how you're generating sound. So just good to kind of know, if you're an acoustic player in particular, how your instrument works, what the actual function of that is. And so some of those characteristics can be important when we're talking about, you know, the pickups in an acoustic and some of the resonance and tone that comes along with hollow body and semi-hollow body guitars. But for the purposes of how we play at church, or our church, probably, you know, most sound stages across the world, we plug in and we use pickups. And that kind of brings us to the next section now, from the body to pickups. And again, this is applicable to all of them. Acoustics are slightly different, so we'll put an asterisk there. But instead of using the vibration of this soundboard, which this doesn't really have, it's a solid body guitar, we use pickups to generate the noise that you hear. And so how does that work? Well, again, same thing with the strings vibrating, but instead of vibrating the guitar now, we're actually vibrating these strings through a magnetic field. And again, physics class here a little bit. Your pickups have, most of the time, a magnet in them with a coil wrapped around it. And that is creating a magnetic field coming up out of the pickups. And as you move this string in that magnetic field, you actually generate a very low amount of current in the coils that are wound around the magnets. And so that becomes the signal then that passes along to pedals or an amplifier and ultimately the soundboard. On acoustics, it's slightly different. They can certainly use magnetic pickups like an electric guitar or a bass guitar, but they may use different types as well. So we won't go too deep into that, but just know that for our purposes, we're plugging in, we're using a pickup of some sort to generate the sound rather than the vibration of the soundboard on an acoustic guitar. So when we've generated that current, that electric current, it passes from those coils around the pickups and it actually goes to volume controls, tone controls, and then out of an output jack on a guitar. Again, this is across all the boards here. And so a really good way of thinking of these controls is the volume is sort of like the on lever for a sink faucet. You can control, hey, I only want a little bit of water to come out of that faucet, or I want full steam, 100% of the water to come out of the faucet. But it doesn't really do much else to dictate the type of water you're getting from it, just the amount of it. So then the tone control is sort of like the ability to turn that faucet to, you know, the hot side or the cold side, and it influences the feeling of that level of signal that you're getting. And then obviously we come out of the output jack and go to the rest of our signal chain, which we'll talk about in other videos. Back to parts on the guitar. PICKGUARD. This is really just to protect the body. It can kind of protect sometimes there's cavities underneath of here, so just to enclose those, make sure dirt and debris don't get in there. And then kind of back to the strings for a second. We'll get to the second mounting point. I talked about the first anchor point up at the nut of the guitar. Well, now we get to our second anchor point. And so that anchor point is actually going to be on the saddle. And so that's these individual pieces here. And you've got on acoustics, a lot of times you'll have just one bar. It'll look exactly like the nut, but it'll be back here. And so that is creating the second anchor point for your strings. And why that's important is now we've got anchor point 1, anchor point 2, and we're creating a perfectly straight line for our strings to rest in, right? This is where we get to another important emphasis on the neck, kind of to jump back in time a little bit here, is that your neck actually wants to have a little bit of a relief, a little bit of concavity to it. And there's an adjustment. You can see it here. It's the black area in there called the truss rod adjustment, which controls a truss rod that runs through the neck. And this is important because you could have a convex shape to your neck where the neck wants to come up closer to the strings, and this is going to create a lot of fret buzz. You're going to hear noise of the strings really smacking on some of the fret wires whenever you strum. You could have a really concave shaped neck, so the neck wants to go away from the strings, and this is going to make it really difficult to press the strings down no matter what other adjustments you do, especially in the middle area of the neck. And then ultimately the goal here, and the reason we have that adjustment, is to create just the very slightest amount of relief in the neck. And this is important because while it might seem like you want the neck to be perfectly flat with the strings, then when you would press down the strings, you would kind of get into some areas where you'd still be creating some buzzing and some issues with the strings sort of hitting and not really ringing out very well. So you want a little bit of relief so that there's clearance when you are fretting a note for the strings to clear the rest of the fret wire. So that's why that truss rod adjustment is important. It's important why we have our anchor point 1, our anchor point 2 creating that perfectly straight line. And it sort of leads us then to our final piece, which is the bridge. This is, I guess, technically really what's holding the strings in place down here. I referred to the saddle as the anchor point, but that's creating more of that straight line anchor versus the bridge is actually holding everything in place. And this is where, again, you can get into some variations. You'll see, like on this guitar, you know, a tremolo bar, which is allowing us to bend the pitch of a string or a note. And so, you know, this is called a Bigsby. That's a brand name. It's kind of like Kleenex for tissues. And you could have, you know, on a Stratocaster, a lot of times you'll have a tremolo bar. Some people call them whammy bars. And there's other you'll notice kind of jewelry or accessories that can be on guitars to do, you know, a bunch of different things. But I think we've really started to cover a lot of the important areas here. Some guitars will have a pickup selector switch, which allows you to pick which of the pickups you're using. And this kind of gets into more of a tone discussion, which we'll talk about later on. But just know that the placement of these pickups influences their sound. The windings of the coil in the pickups can influence their sound. We could adjust this pickup or this pickup to be higher or lower, closer to the strings, to adjust the sound, and that's why we'd want to be able to pick which pickup we're using for a specific application in a song. So I think we've really covered most of the physical components on any typical guitar that you would encounter, and that kind of leads us to the next place where we can start to apply some of these things. So real quick, I'm just going to run over some common issues that you maybe have encountered or you might encounter if you're getting into guitar, and kind of talk about them, and you'll start to see, and it'll make sense why all of these various things are important to know the name of and to learn. So, you know, the first one we sort of talked about already, maybe the strings are too high. This is a really common complaint of new guitars. It's hard to press down. Well, again, it could be that your neck relief is set, it's way too relieved, it's concave. It could be that the nut is too high, so you can actually take this out and sand down the bottom to lower that first anchor point. Similarly, you can, on this guitar, you could lower the saddle piece so that the strings set lower on this end, and that can kind of help with the height of the strings. That's a really good term then to bring up, is the height of the strings is sometimes colloquially called action. So if you hear someone talking about the action of a guitar, they're referring to the height of the strings. You could have the opposite issue where the strings are too low, too close to the fretboard, and then you're getting buzz. When you strum a note, you hear some rattling of the strings hitting against the fret wires. Again, same adjustments, but the opposite direction. Or again, you could have the neck could be too convex. You could be struggling with your guitar going out of tune too often. A lot of times this can happen because your tuners are not tight, or they're not getting a good bite on the string. You don't have enough string wound around there. A lot of times this happens with guitars that do have a tremolo system. You're bending that string and putting extra tension on it, and then when it lets go, they don't release to the same place they were at before. So that's a common issue. Another big one, which is a term that I think a lot of guitarists hear but don't often know, is intonation. So this is the concept of if we strum this low 6th string, it makes an E note, and we can tune to that E note at a certain frequency in hertz, and then we know that the E repeats at the 12th fret. So if we fret here at the 12th and we hit that note again, the concept would be we want it to make the exact same E note just at 1 octave higher pitch. And so if it does, that's great, we're spot on. We want that across all of the strings to be able to do that for the individual note. And this is called intonation, setting the intonation on your guitar, really. If it's a little bit sharp or a little bit flat, then our intonation is off. So we can adjust that. Again, real quick, we won't go too deep into it, but you can adjust these saddle pieces forward or backwards to adjust the length of the string actually by those anchor points. And that is what plays into that intonation there. You could be having a muddy sound or a really overdriven sound even though you're trying to play through a clean amp or a clean setup. A lot of times this has to do with pickup height and adjustments there. So those are some pretty general issues that you may run into when you're first getting into guitar, and hopefully you start to see now why it's important to know the various pieces of guitar, what they do, what they're called, and how they work together, and you see that there's a bunch of different adjustments you can do to help the playability of the guitar, the sound of the guitar, and certainly to help you be able to talk to someone or troubleshoot with someone or receive feedback maybe from a sound person or tech production person telling you, hey, this is what I'm hearing, this is what I'm getting from you. Now you maybe know where to start to turn or to go to someone and ask for help by identifying some key areas. So with that, we've covered a lot of the basics of guitars. What did you learn? Go ahead in the comments, drop one thing that you learned today, something that was new to you or something that you'd heard before but you didn't quite understand. And then a little bit of homework for this week. We talked about physics of how guitars worked, kind of the engineering that goes into how they're put together and how they link up. So this week, homework, when you're using the tuners, think in your mind, hey, these are tuners, and what are they doing? Well, they're adjusting, the tension of the string. Or, hey, I'm strumming this. Wow, it's crazy that the vibration is being picked up by pickups, or it's in an acoustic, it's creating this vibration. Think through some of these things as you're using them and start to remember them, start to understand how they work. And if you have any questions, drop them in the comments or grab me or someone else on the team, and we'll be happy to help you. Hopefully these come in handy and are useful to you.